All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Looks like you've got a real thinker's topic for us this time. Descartes, huh? Specifically, his theory of ideas, based on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry you sent over.
Yep, you definitely went deep with this one.
And given your own background in philosophy, I mean, you're probably already familiar with at least some of this stuff, but
Yeah.
but we're going to try to like really dig in and unearth the core of what Descartes was getting at with this whole idea thing.
Yeah, it's one of those things that sounds pretty basic on the surface.
Yeah.
Ideas.
Right.
But it's really foundational for understanding, like, pretty much all of modern philosophy.
Okay, so for you listening out there, our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to unpack this whole concept of an idea in Descartes' world. What are they? What role do they play in his system? What kinds did he come up with? And we're not just talking definitions here. This gets into the nitty-gritty of how he saw reality itself. Substances, attributes, modes,
All that good stuff.
the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. How do we know anything at all? That's really what's at stake here.
And I think what might surprise you, especially with your philosophical leanings, is that Descartes doesn't treat ideas the way, say, Plato did with his forms. They're not these grand ultimate realities in his view.
Right, that's a really important place to start. You can't just import Plato's framework into Descartes. It's a completely different ballgame. To really get what Descartes was doing, we have to begin with his basic ontology. Substances, attributes, and modes.
Okay, so we've got to lay the groundwork here. This is Descartes' blueprint for how things exist.
Right, so think of it as like a hierarchy. You've got substances at the top. Those are the independent, self-existing things like minds and bodies. Then you've got attributes. Those are the essential defining characteristics of substances, like thought for the mind and extension for the body.
Okay, so a mind thinks, a body takes up space.
Precisely.
Uh-huh.
And then at the bottom level, you have modes. These are the ways in which attributes are expressed or manifested.
So like a mode is like a specific way for something to be. The Stanford Encyclopedia uses a really clear example, shape as a mode of extension. So like a body is extended, right? That's its attribute, but it can exist in a particular shape. That's a mode.
Yeah, perfect example. So now, where do ideas fit into all of this? They're not substances, right? They're not attributes. So
They're modes.
they're modes, exactly. And specifically for Descartes, ideas are modes of thinking.
That's right. So thought is the mind's main attribute. And an idea is just a way in which that thinking happens, a way it expresses itself.
Just like a specific shape is a way of being extended, a particular idea, say, the idea of a triangle, is a way of thinking.
So it's not floating out there in some abstract realm. It's fundamentally dependent on this whole structure, right?
Absolutely. It depends on the attribute of thought, which itself depends on the existence of a thinking thing, a mind.
This is such a key point for you listening in. It completely flips the script on how we usually think about ideas, especially coming from, a more Platonic perspective. They're not the ultimate, most real things for Descartes. They're more like the tools or processes within the mind.
Yeah, and that shift has had like a huge impact on the trajectory of Western thought.
Totally. But okay, so even though they're down there at this mode level, they're still doing some serious heavy lifting in Descartes' system.
Oh yeah, they're definitely not unimportant.
Right. I mean, they're how we represent things to ourselves.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Ideas are the vehicles of representation for Descartes. And this is another really big departure from Plato. For Plato, like, Socrates was a representation of the form of man. But for Descartes, it's the idea of Socrates in your mind that represents Socrates to you. The idea is doing the work.
Okay, so ideas, modes of thinking, how we represent stuff. Now, Descartes doesn't just stop there. He digs deeper into these modes of thinking.
He does. And it's in the third meditation where we really get into this. He talks about simple and complex modes of thinking.
Right.
And ideas themselves fall under the category of simple modes.
Simple modes, okay.
Now, complex modes of thinking are things like doubting, judging, willing, feeling, those kinds of things.
Right, so those are more involved. It's not just a simple idea of something.
Exactly. And the important thing is complex modes always have ideas as components. You can't have a complex mode without a simple mode. So like if you're doubting something, say the existence of free will, you first need to have an idea of free will to even begin doubting it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. You can't doubt what you don't have some concept of. So these ideas are like the building blocks, the raw materials of more complex thoughts. So what exactly are these simple ideas, according to Descartes?
Well, he often describes them as it were, the images of things.
Okay. So we're dealing with images here, but they're not like literal photographs in our mind.
Right, they're more like mental pictures.
Yeah.
And he gives all sorts of examples: a human being, a chimera, the sky, an angel, even God.
And it's not just like these, big abstract things. It also includes our sensory experiences, right?
Exactly, the idea of red, the idea of cold, the idea of a sound.
But as you said, it's crucial to remember these aren't literal copies. The Stanford Encyclopedia is really clear about that. An idea doesn't have to resemble what it represents.
Right. Like the idea of cold isn't actually cold itself. And obviously the idea of God, who's supposed to be immaterial, isn't some kind of picture.
Right, right. Okay, so they're representations, presentations to the mind. But where do these ideas come from in the first place? Do they just kind of pop up?
Well, for Descartes, the initial production of ideas comes from the intellect. That's basically the faculty of understanding, the ability to form these basic representations.
So it's like our mind's ability to grasp concepts, to
Yeah.
form those basic mental images.
Exactly. But then the will comes into play when we do more complicated things with those ideas. Like if you affirm or deny something about the idea, or if you use it to make a judgment.
So, like, the intellect gives you the idea of a triangle, but it's your will that leads you to decide whether you believe a particular triangle is equilateral or not.
Exactly. It's that higher level engagement with the content of the idea.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia helpfully lays out like a whole bunch of ways Descartes talks about ideas. The form of any given thought, whatever is immediately perceived by the mind, any object of thought, everything which is in our mind when we conceive something. That's a lot of descriptions.
hmm
What's the common denominator here? What ties all of these together?
I think the core element here, and this is super important philosophically, is intentionality.
Intentionality.
Yeah, basically it's this idea that our thoughts, and specifically our ideas, are always about something. They point towards or represent something beyond themselves.
They have this inherent directedness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that directedness, that aboutness, is what makes an idea a representation in Descartes' view.
So they're not just random mental events. They have this essential link to something else. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia gets into two major ways of understanding what those objects of thought are: representationalism and direct realism.
Right. And this is a huge point of debate, even today.
Big time. So for our listener who's really into the philosophical weeds here, can you unpack the core difference between these two views?
Absolutely. So representationalism basically says that when we have an idea, the immediate thing we're aware of is something purely mental. It's the content of the idea itself.
So like when I have the idea of a tree, I'm not directly experiencing the actual tree outside my window.
Nope. What you're directly experiencing is your mental representation of the tree.
So it's like a mental stand-in for the real deal.
Right. And this mental representation is a kind of third thing, a tertium quid, that mediates between your mind and the actual tree out there.
Okay. So it's all happening in the mind, essentially. But what about direct realism? What's that view all about?
Direct realism says that the immediate objects of our awareness can be either mental or extramental. So sometimes we're directly in touch with stuff outside our minds.
So in that view, when I have the idea of a tree, my mind is kind of reaching out and grasping the tree itself. There's no intermediary mental image getting in the way.
Exactly. And the same goes for things that don't exist in the physical world. Like the idea of a unicorn is a mental operation directed at a unicorn, even though unicorns are just a mental construct.
Okay. So direct realism is saying we can have this direct, unmediated connection to the world, both real and imagined.
Right. It's all about denying that there always has to be this mental middleman.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia focuses on the representationalist view when explaining Descartes. Why is that? Why is that a useful way to approach his ideas?
Well, even though both views have their supporters, representationalism just seems to fit better with certain aspects of Descartes' philosophy, especially when it comes to his distinction between formal and objective reality, which is where we're headed next.
Okay, so buckle up, listener, because we're about to go even deeper into the conceptual rabbit hole. Formal and objective reality, two key pieces of the Cartesian puzzle.
Big time. And honestly, they can be a little tricky to wrap your head around, so let's break them down. Formal reality is basically just the reality something has by virtue of existing. Like the sun has formal reality because it's out there actually existing in the world. A centaur doesn't have formal reality because it's just a mythical creature.
Right, so it's about actually being a thing in the world. But then what is objective reality? How is that different?
Well, objective reality is the reality that an idea possesses by virtue of representing something. So even though a centaur doesn't have formal reality, the idea of a centaur has objective reality because it's representing something, even if that something doesn't actually exist.
Okay, so it's the reality of what the idea is about, regardless of whether that thing is real in the formal sense.
Exactly. And the really interesting thing is that for Descartes, ideas have both formal and objective reality.
Right, so they exist as mental things in our minds, and they represent things, whether those things exist or not.
Precisely. Now, just like there are levels of being in formal reality, like an infinite substance is more real than a finite substance, there are also levels of objective reality.
Okay, so how does that work?
It pretty much mirrors the hierarchy of formal reality.
Hmm.
An idea that represents an infinite substance, like the idea of God, has the highest level of objective reality. Then you've got ideas that represent finite substances, like a tree or a person. And then at the lowest level, you have ideas that represent modes, like the idea of a particular shape or color.
So the idea of God is like the top dog in the objective reality realm. And this distinction is super important for Descartes' whole argument for God's existence, right?
It's absolutely crucial. He argues that the idea of God, with all its objective reality, couldn't have come from his own finite mind because his mind just doesn't have that much formal reality to give.
Right, like you can't get something from nothing. There has to be at least as much reality in the cause as there is in the effect.
Precisely. And since the idea of God represents an infinite substance, its cause has to have at least that much formal reality, which means God has to exist.
Wow. Okay, so we've got formal reality, objective reality. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia also mentions this thing called the material objective distinction. Is that just another way of saying the same thing?
Some scholars think so, yeah. It's like looking at the same distinction from a slightly different angle.
So what's the different angle?
Well, the material sense of idea refers to it as a mental act, like an operation of the intellect. It's the idea considered as a mode of thinking, something that exists in your mind.
Okay. And in that sense, the idea can't be more perfect than the mind that produces it.
Right. But then the objective sense of idea refers to the thing that's being represented by that mental act. And that thing, even if it doesn't actually exist outside the mind, can have a greater degree of perfection than your finite mind.
Okay, so it's like focusing on the process of having the idea versus the content of the idea.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia suggests that Descartes uses the formal objective distinction when he's talking about where ideas come from, how they connect to reality. But the material objective distinction comes up when he's talking about the relationship between the mental act itself and what it represents.
Okay, so it's like two different ways of slicing the same conceptual pie.
That's a good way to put it.
All right, so we've tackled those distinctions. Now let's move on to something a bit more straightforward, at least on the surface. Descartes' famous three types of ideas: innate, adventitious, and factitious.
Yeah, this is his way of classifying ideas based on where they come from.
Right. So let's walk through those. What are innate ideas?
These are the ideas that seem to be built into us from the start. They arise from our very nature as thinking beings. Descartes gives examples like the idea of what a thing is, the idea of truth, the idea of thought itself.
So these are like the basic conceptual building blocks that we need to even think about anything at all.
Exactly. They're not learned from experience. They're just part of the structure of our minds.
Okay, so innate ideas, we're born with them or they're just inherently there. What about adventitious ideas?
These are the ideas that seem to come from outside of us, through our senses. Things like seeing the sun, hearing a sound, feeling heat.
So these are all about sensory experience.
Right. And Descartes points out that a lot of these ideas arise involuntarily. Like, you don't choose to feel pain, it just happens to you.
Right, right. So it seems like these ideas are caused by things acting on our senses from the outside world.
Exactly.
And then we've got factitious ideas. What are those?
Those are the ideas that we seem to invent or make up ourselves, like a unicorn or a chimera.
So these are all about the imagination, taking bits and pieces of other ideas and combining them.
Exactly. It's like taking the idea of a horse and the idea of wings and putting them together to create a Pegasus.
All right, so we've got our three categories: innate, adventitious, factitious. Pretty straightforward, right?
Well, not quite. Descartes' own analysis of his idea of God throws a bit of a wrench in the system.
Yeah, how does that work? He says the idea of God is innate, but we don't sense God directly, and we can't just construct the idea of an infinite being from scratch.
Exactly. That's his argument. He says the idea of God can't be adventitious because we have no sensory experience of God. And it can't be factitious because our finite minds can't conceive of actual infinity on their own.
So he concludes that it must be innate. implanted in us by God.
Right. And that leads to a more nuanced view of what innate even means. It might not just be about having fully formed ideas from birth. It might also be about having a certain capacity or disposition to form those ideas.
So it's not just content, but potential. And that's where the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up the role interpretation of innate ideas.
Right. This interpretation focuses on how innate ideas function as frameworks that make other things intelligible. Like, we need the innate idea of extension, the idea of space, to understand the idea of a particular shape.
So they're like the underlying structures that make other ideas possible. And Descartes seems to think that the ideas of God, mind, body, and the union of mind and body are all innate in this way. They're like the foundation of his whole system. Now, Stanford Encyclopedia also throws in another way of dividing up ideas: primary and non-primary.
Yeah, this one focuses on where the objective reality of the idea ultimately comes from.
Okay, so what are primary ideas?
Primary ideas are those whose objective reality originates in the formal reality of something outside the mind, like the innate idea of God, the innate idea of body, and the adventitious idea of the sun.
So those ideas are directly grounded in something that actually exists.
Right. But non-primary ideas have their objective reality originating in the objective reality of other ideas.
So it's like ideas built on other ideas.
Exactly. And factitious ideas, like the idea of a Pegasus, fall into this category. Their objective reality comes from the ideas of horses and wings, which themselves have objective reality.
Wow, okay. It's getting pretty meta at this point.
It does get a little heady. But it's all about Descartes trying to figure out how our mental representations connect to reality.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia pulls all of this together with the principle of representation, or PR.
Right. This principle basically says that a primary idea can only represent something if its objective reality comes from the formal reality of that thing.
So the idea's got to be causally connected to the thing it represents. It can't just be a random mental image.
Exactly. The representation has to be grounded in the reality of what it's representing.
And they use a really helpful analogy to illustrate this: Socrates and a mirror.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. So Socrates and the mirror both have formal reality because they exist.
Yeah.
The image of Socrates in the mirror has objective reality because it represents Socrates. But where does that image come from?
From Socrates himself.
Exactly. The mirror is just the medium. So in the same way, our primary ideas represent things because their objective reality ultimately traces back to the formal reality of those things.
So it's all about this causal chain, this grounding in what's actually real. Right, that's PR. Now, the last section of the Stanford Encyclopedia entry you shared goes back to Descartes' early work, The Rules for the Direction of the Mind.
Right, and this is where we get into the concepts of simple natures, clarity, and distinctness.
Okay, so how do those fit in with his whole theory of ideas?
Well, in the rules, Descartes talks about these things called simple natures. They're like the most basic, fundamental building blocks of both our ideas and the things themselves, like the simple nature of color, shape, extension, thought.
So they're like the ultimate atoms of reality and thought.
Exactly. And even though Descartes doesn't use the term simple natures in the same way in his later work, the idea of these basic elements is still there.
Okay, so simple natures are like the foundation of everything.
Right. And in the rules, he suggests that they're organized in this hierarchical system based on what needs to be known to know something else. Like, you need to understand the simple nature of extension before you can understand the idea of a specific shape.
Okay, so there's this order to knowledge.
Exactly.
And then we get to clarity and distinctness. How do those relate to simple natures?
An idea is considered clear when the connections between its simple natures are really obvious to the mind. Like, if you understand how the simple nature of extension is connected to the simple nature of shape, then your idea of a triangle will be clear.
So it's about seeing how the basic building blocks fit together.
Right. And a distinct idea is one that's clearly separated from other ideas. Like, if you can clearly distinguish between the idea of a triangle and the idea of a square, then those ideas are distinct.
Okay, so clarity is about understanding the internal structure of an idea, and distinctness is about differentiating it from other ideas.
Precisely. And those qualities are essential for Descartes because he believes that whatever we perceive clearly and distinctly is true.
That's his famous truth rule.
Exactly. And that rule is based on the idea that clear and distinct ideas are the ones that accurately represent reality.
Because they're properly grounded in those simple natures that make up the world.
Right. So clarity and distinctness are essential for knowledge.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions this argument by Wall, who says that For Descartes, truth isn't just in our minds, it's also in the simple natures themselves.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. It suggests that the simple natures have a kind of objective reality, a way of being that's independent of our minds.
So it's like they exist out there in the world, and our clear and distinct ideas are tapping into that reality.
Right. And that view seems to bridge the gap between representationalism and direct realism a bit.
Because it suggests that we're not just stuck in our own mental representations, we can actually make contact with the real world through these simple natures.
Exactly.
And then there's Hoffman's suggestion that the simple natures themselves have both formal and objective reality.
Right, that's a pretty radical idea. It means that the simple natures wouldn't just be building blocks of reality, they'd also be inherently representational.
So, like, the simple nature of redness wouldn't just be a property of things, it would also be something that can be directly perceived by the mind.
Exactly. But that view has some problems, as the Stanford Encyclopedia points out.
Because Descartes says that ideas are what have objective reality.
Right. So if simple natures also had objective reality, it would kind of mess up his whole system.
All right, well, it seems like we've covered a lot of ground here. From simple ideas to complex modes of thinking, formal and objective reality, innate, adventitious, and factitious ideas, the principle of representation, simple natures, clarity, and distinctness.
We've been all over the map.
Whew, that was a deep dive. And it's clear that Descartes' theory of ideas is anything but simple. It's complex, nuanced, and still debated by philosophers today. But it's also foundational to so much of modern thought.
It really is. Understanding Descartes and ideas is crucial for understanding the history of philosophy and even for thinking about our own minds and how we know what we know.
So for you listening, this deep dive should give you a much better grasp on one of the most important thinkers in Western philosophy. And as always, we want to leave you with something to ponder.
Given Descartes' emphasis on clarity and distinctness, how do you think his ideas apply to the complexities of philosophy today? Is there still a place for his rigorous approach in a world where things are often messy and uncertain?
It's a great question, and we encourage you to keep exploring Descartes' work and the many ways philosophers have interpreted and built upon his ideas. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.